All right, so this is our final project for SAL 413 regarding batter's height and its effectiveness on called balls and strikes in the MLB. I'm Brandon Wunderlich.
And I'm Dylan McGee.
So the questions that we wanted to think about were whether or not varying height of batters affected called balls and strikes that were called by umpires. Additionally, what certain types of pitches are more likely to be called one way or the other, depending depending on how tall the batter is, and how can we use the information that we find in order to help batters and pitchers determining which spots in the zone that would be most effective or batters should be most cautious about when up to bat. And to start thinking about this, we kind of assumed that taller batters would have more pitches outside of the strike zone called strikes on them, especially lower in the zone below the knees. And we thought this because based on watching games and general hypotheses and theories, it's believed that taller players get more strikes called them that often are thought that shouldn't be strikes. So what we wanted to do was break down the data that we found into three different sections by size or height of batters. And after that, we wanted to scrape pitch by pitch data from Baseball Savant and make pitch charts similar to some that we've seen in class for each size and find percentage of balls that ended up being called strikes outside of the zone. And to find this player height data, it was pretty simple. We downloaded the updated 2019 Layman database from SeanLayman.com, filtered the people CSV by final game equal to 2019 to only include players that played during the 2019 regular season. And the naming on the CSV was kind of weird regarding players' actual names, so we created a new full name column that combined name first and name last in order to join the scrape data that we got later on. And once we did get this data, we began by breaking down 1,399 players that played during the season into three different categories by height, which their heights ranged from 5'6" or 66 inches to 82 inches, which would be 6'10". We calculated the projected strike zones measured in inches above home plate, starting at the knees and ending at the middle, or normally assumed to be starting at the knees and ending at the middle section of a batter's chest. We found out the small batters group to be 16.8 inches minimum above the ground and 39.16 inches maximum above the ground, medium being 18 minimum and 42 maximum, and large 19.7 minimum and 45.41 maximum. In order to find these, we took the numbers and divided them by 12 for our pitch charts, both the min and max.
So these are some of the examples of the players that are in the three categories of size group. So in the small group, we have players like Mookie Betts, Jose Altuve, Jose Ramirez, and Colton Wong. In the medium-sized group, we see players like Gleyber Torres, Jock Peterson, Pete Alonso, and Vladimir Guerrero Jr. And in the large group, we see players like Aaron Judge, Giancarlo Stanton, Grayson Greiner, and Noah Syndergaard. And although that Syndergaard is a pitcher, because he's in the National League, he still faces batters, so he has pitch charts as well. So first, we had to scrape and compile our data, which we did using R, and we were able to use the Baseball R package in RStudio to scrape every single play from StatCast and Baseball Savant, which they offer. The best way to go about this, which we learned from lecture, was to scrape week by week. In order to do that, you just start at the first month and go week by week, and then we're able to use the rbind function to bind the 5 weeks together for that individual month. So if you see in the left screenshot, you see how we did it for April and May. And then on the right is us combining all the months that were rbinded originally into one rbind to have a complete data set of every pitch that was thrown in the 2019 season. We named that data set Batted Ball 2019. Next, we decided to join this with our player height data from Layman's database that we just talked about. We called this people_2019. And we just read that CSV file included with the additional tab for the player's full name. And then we were able to merge the data sets using a full join. So as you can see in the bottom screenshot, we named this Batted Ball with height 2019. And that's just a full join with both data sets by player_name, which is used in the data set we created, and full name, which is from Layman's database. Next, we decided to create some visualizations. We wanted to make sure visuals for every pitch that batters face can be in their respective categories. So with these, we could see which type of batters are getting certain pitches called wrong and where exactly in the zone. We also used gathered data to create 33 pitch charts in total. One chart for every pitch thrown for 3 different height groups. To compare every single pitch thrown, no matter what pitch it was, and then also one for each pitch type listed on Baseball Savant, thrown outside of our created strike zone for each height group for 2019. That way we can see if there's a certain pitch for the large batters that is getting called improperly, at where exactly it is, so players can look at these trends and know better in the future. So here's a portion of our code. This is for all the pitch types. As you can see in the first line, on line 1006, we see the name of our created filtered or our created data set that was joined by player name, and it's filtered by height less than 72 inches. Therefore, that's a small group. And then we're describing every scenario in which the description of the pitch from Baseball Savant was either a called strike or a ball. And next, we use plate_x to determine the width, or the horizontal axis, and plate Z for the vertical axis. Plate Z was created by us. We used plate X from our example in lecture with Dr. Ehrlich, but plate Z was calculated by us that we showed earlier when we divided every minimum and maximum for the projected height by 12. We named this small total, and from there we're allowed to get a count for the small total, and that gives us every single pitch that was thrown in 2019 to batters under 72 inches that were called strikes and balls that were outside of our strike zone that we created for this age group, or for this size group. From there, we could also count the amount that were called strikes. On the left on line 1009 is 4,455 called strikes in this exact scenario out of 54,986 pitches total. From there, we were able to create a visualization with our filtered data. As you can see, a lot of the filtered definitions are very similar to what we did in the first part. The only difference is actually using K_zone_plot to plot that and make it look visually appealing so we can get the best conclusions possible. Here's the result for that line of code. The visualization for all called strikes and balls that are outside of our created strike zone for players in the small group. Pitch types are represented by characters. If you look in the top right, you see some examples there. However, because there's so many pitches, like we said, there's over 54,000 for this scenario specifically, it's tough to see which pitches were thrown where. What we want you to see is the difference in the colors. Blue represents pitches that were called strikes outside of our created strike zones. In this example, we end up getting a called strike percentage of 8.1%, which is relatively high. It's just a little bit above average compared to other things that we've seen. But we ran this for all 3 size groups, and we were able to compare them, which we'll show that at the end with our conclusions. And here's a portion of our code for individual pitch types. It's very similar, except for in the first line, line 717, we see the pitch type is equal to FF. FF stands for four-seam fastball from Baseball Savant's database. So this is specifically looking for every pitch in the large height group because we see the height is greater than 77 inches. That was a fastball. Other than that, our code is pretty much exactly the same. If you look on line 740, that last number, 884, that's to represent the total amount of pitches, which we found on line 718 using count large FF for large size group four-seam fastball. That way we can see every pitch charted within that specific scenario. And here's what it ended up looking like. It's much easier to read where pitches went and where they're called balls and strikes in the zone. And as you can see from this graph, tall batters rarely got incorrectly called strikes on fastballs above their created strike zone. However, on pitches that were low and away, or low and on the right side of the plate, because this accounts for righty and lefty batters, it seems that there's a higher chance for a player to have a pitch incorrectly called a strike. So this is something a tall player could note in the future. Here is all the 30 charts, actually 33 charts if you include the totals, but the 30 individual pitch charts. Just quickly screenshotted to show that we have. As you can see on the right, they're ordered from small, medium, and large, and on the right is the large group. There weren't many players in the large group just because there's not that many tall players that play in the MLB. However, it's clear that the majority of players fall in the medium category. That's where we see that those deep red colors, because there's just a higher volume of pitches that are being thrown to those batters. And our charts ended up showing great findings about certain pitches in different locations outside of the zone. And here's just another example of our file. This is just a PDF of every instance. So this is our small group, and this is a four-seam fastball for the two-seam, changeup, curveball, etc. There are 10 pitches in total, one being a fork ball, which didn't really show much because fork balls are rarely thrown in the MLB, at least in 2019. And then this was the complete chart. And then just to briefly show you, this is the medium group. This is their complete chart. And then here's the last group and their final chart. So to conclude, our hypothesis was correct. Ultimately, we did see that the taller group experienced more balls, which were accidentally called strikes outside of their zone than any other group. If you look at the chart on the bottom, we see a total 9.255% of the time pitches that were supposed to be called balls, according to our created strike zone, were called strikes, compared to 8.1 for the small group and 7.6 by the medium group. I think it makes the most sense, in our opinion, for the medium-sized group to receive the most accurate calls, because for a couple reasons. One, they're the standard height, and two, they just have higher players. So maybe since N, which represents the amount of people, is higher, the results might be more accurate. The small group received the highest percentage with off-speed pitches, which we found really interesting. If you see, the large group had the highest numbers in four-seam, two-seam, and changeup, but breaking ball pitches like curveball, cutter, and slider all fell to the small size group. We're not too sure why, but we believe maybe because breaking balls usually start high and break down, could have a factor with the umpire in judging what's a ball and what's a strike. And with this knowledge, batters, depending on their size, can use this to better understand their strike zone and be more or less aggressive in certain locations in the zone. As we can see, smaller players seem to have more pitches up in the zone called strikes, as we see on the graph on the left, and taller players tend to have lower pitches called strikes, as we see on the right. And lastly, we just wanted to include some changes that we would do in the future to better this study. Maybe have a higher sample size, more than just 2019 batted ball data. The large group, as we said, doesn't have nearly as many players, so not as much data. The more data we can get for them, the more accurate results we could get. Also create better calculation for average size strike zone for each group. This would probably take some more advanced research, but we do believe our strike zones are relatively accurate, and we broke them down as evenly as possible, but there probably is a more efficient way of creating a more ideal zone for those average height groups. And lastly, create a function R that can run through all pitch charts for different pitches instead of creating code for each pitch. If you look at our RStudio code, we did end up having over 1,000 lines of code. We started with including our packages, and this is where we scraped the data for each week. This is where we combine them together. We then merged the data sets, and then this is where we started plugging away with code to ultimately create our zones. A lot of them aren't showing up here. I do have some examples on the bottom because I did restart my R because so much information was making my computer run pretty slow. But like we said, if we created a function that could run this for each pitch instead of manually doing it, because this is, for example, this is a sinker, and then here we had to do it for a knuckle curve and etc. for each group. So if we did that, it probably would have made our code much more compact and efficient. And here are our references. And thank you again for taking the time to listen to our presentation, and feel free to leave any questions. Thank you.
Thanks for watching.